He struck her across the face in front of the entire police station. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. A 24-year-old rookie stood there, cheek burning red, and did not cry out, did not stumble. She simply turned her head back slowly and looked her attacker dead in the eyes. "Some men mistake silence for weakness," she said quietly. "That's usually the last mistake they make." What Sergeant Garrett Voss did not know that day was simple. The woman he just slapped was not a rookie at all. She was the daughter of the police chief he helped bury 12 years ago. And in 9 days, she would be sitting in his chair, holding proof that would tear this entire town apart. He had just made the worst mistake of his life. He just didn't know it yet. Every small town has a story it doesn't like to tell. Millbrook, Ohio is one of those towns. From the outside, it looks perfect. A church on Main Street. A diner that still serves coffee for $1. Old men who sit on the same bench every morning just to watch the world go by. The leaves were just starting to turn that weak gold and rust-colored against a pale autumn sky. Farmers brought their trucks into town on Saturdays, selling pumpkins and apple cider from the backs of flatbeds. Children rode bicycles down streets where every neighbor still waved from their porch. It was the kind of town people wrote about in postcards. The kind of town people moved away from and then spent years trying to find their way back to. But under that quiet surface, something had been rotting for 12 years. And it took one young woman walking through the front doors of the Millbrook Police Department on an ordinary Tuesday morning to finally bring it into the light. Her name was Sloane Hart. She was 24 years old, blonde hair pulled back tight, blue eyes that gave nothing away. She didn't look like someone about to change everything. She looked like someone easy to overlook. That was exactly the plan. It was 7:45 in the morning when Sloane parked outside the station. The building was old brick built sometime in the 50s. An American flag hung above the door, faded from years of sun and rain. She sat in her car a moment before going in. In her hand, she held a small silver pocket watch. It had belonged to her father. The case was worn smooth from years of being carried close. On the inside cover was an engraving. Duty, honor, quiet strength. She traced the words with her thumb, the way she always did before something hard. Then she took a breath, tucked the watch away, and stepped out of the car. She was not walking in as a rookie that morning. Not really. But almost no one in that building knew that yet. 9 days earlier, in a quiet office 2 hours away, Sloane had sat across from Mayor Grace Whitfield. The mayor was in her 60s. Silver hair, sharp eyes. The kind of woman who had spent decades learning how to read people. "You understand what I'm asking you to do," the mayor said. Sloane nodded. "You want me to go in as a new officer. No rank, no title, just watch. For 9 days, the mayor said, before the state hearing. Before anyone knows you're the one who's been appointed." Sloane looked down at her hands. "There have been complaints for years," the mayor continued, "about that department, about how they treat people. I need someone who can see it firsthand, not from a report, not from a file. And if I find something," Sloane said quietly, "bigger than bad attitudes." The mayor's face grew still. "Then you'll have 9 days to prove it," she said, "before the hearing decides whether that department even survives." The mayor had leaned back in her chair that day, studying Sloane carefully. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Of course." "Why does someone your age want a job like this? You could have taken a desk somewhere quiet, a law firm, a comfortable office with your name on the door." Sloane had considered the question a long moment before answering. "Because comfortable offices don't fix broken towns," she said. "Somebody has to be willing to walk into the mess." The mayor had smiled at that just slightly. "You remind me of someone," she said. "I can't quite place who." Sloane had not told her the full truth that day. She had not said that her father once wore that same badge, that he had died in that same town 12 years ago in a car accident that never quite made sense to her. She had not said that she had spent years since studying law, studying procedures, studying patience, all. so she could one day walk back into Millbrook and finally ask the questions no one else would ask. She kept that part to herself. Some things she believed were better carried quietly, like a watch in a pocket. Back in the... Sloane walked through the front doors of the Millbrook Police Department for the first time. The lobby smelled like old coffee and printer ink. A bulletin board on the wall was covered in community notices, most of them faded and curling at the corners. A woman sat behind the dispatch desk. 60s silver-haired glasses pushed low on her nose. A small nameplate read, "Dorothy Byrne." Dorothy looked up as Sloane approached. For just a second, something flickered across her face, a kind of recognition, like she had seen this face somewhere before a long time ago. But she said nothing, just smiled politely. "You must be the new officer," Dorothy said. "Captain Pruitt is expecting you." "Thank you," Sloane said. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had learned a long time ago not to let nerves show on the surface. Dorothy buzzed her through a side door into the bullpen where the officers worked. That was where Sloane first laid eyes on Sergeant Garrett Voss. Voss stood near the coffee machine laughing loudly with two younger officers. Early 50s thick through the shoulders, silver creeping into his hair. He wore his badge like a crown, almost 30 years on the force. Everyone knew him. Everyone, it seemed, was a little afraid of him, too. He turned when Sloane walked in, and his eyes moved over her the way some men's eyes do, sizing her up in a single glance. "Well, look at this," Voss said loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Did somebody order a rookie?" A few of the younger officers laughed, mostly out of habit. Sloane said nothing. She simply nodded and kept walking toward the captain's office. Voss stepped slightly into her path. "I'm talking to you," he said, still smiling, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "New girl, you got a name." "Officer Hart," she said simply. "Hart," Voss repeated, tasting the word like it amused him. "Cute, real cute." He looked her up and down again. "Well, Officer Hart," he said, "welcome to the real world. Hope you brought your reading glasses, because around here we mostly need someone who can file paperwork and answer phones." More laughter. Someone whistled. Sloane's face didn't change, not even a flicker. She simply said, "I'll try to keep up." And she walked past him into Captain Pruitt's office. Captain Owen Pruitt was heavy-set, late 50s. Tired eyes, a coffee stain on his tie that looked like it had been there for years. He knew who Sloane really was. "I was one of only 2 people in that building who did." "Officer Hart," he said, standing to shake her hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes carried something like an apology. "Welcome to Millbrook." "Thank you, Captain." He gestured for her to sit. "You understand the arrangement," he said quietly, once the door was closed. 9 days. No title. No rank showing. You're a rookie in every way that matters, as far as this department is concerned. "I understand." "It won't be easy," Pruitt said. "Some of the men here don't exactly roll out the welcome mat for new officers. Especially young ones. Especially." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Sloane finished it for him in her mind. "Especially women." "I can handle it," she said. Pruitt studied her a moment. There was something in her eyes, a stillness that reminded him of someone. He couldn't quite place it. Not yet. "All right then," he said. "Let's get you settled." After she left his office, Pruitt sat alone a moment, staring at the closed door. He had served under Walter Hart as a young officer decades ago, back before ambition and fear had taught him to keep his head down and his questions to himself. He still remembered the day they told him Walter's death was ruled an accident. He remembered how quickly the case had closed, how few questions anyone had been allowed to ask. He had told himself over the years that it was simply the way small towns worked. Old wounds left alone. Old questions left buried. Watching Walter's daughter walk through that door today, calm and unshaken, had cracked something loose in him he thought had settled long ago. He picked up his phone and typed a short message to Mayor Whitfield. "She's here. It begins." Then he set the phone down and went back to work, carrying that old, unfinished guilt a little closer to the surface than he had in years. Her first assignment that morning was simple. Paperwork. Filing old reports in a back room that clearly hadn't been organized in years. Voss made sure of it personally. "We like to break in the new ones slow," he told her, dropping a stack of folders on the desk with a thud. "Learn the ropes. Learn your place." Sloane looked at the stack, then at him. "Understood, Sergeant," she said. No argument, no hesitation. Voss seemed almost disappointed she didn't push back. Before she sat down, Sloane reached into her jacket pocket, checking the time on the old silver watch out of habit, the way she did a dozen times a day without even thinking about it. Voss noticed. "What is that?" he said, reaching out before she could stop him, plucking the watch right from her fingers. He turned it over once, studying the worn case, the faded engraving. "This thing's an antique," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Looks like something a broke old man would carry." "It was my father's, now," Sloane said quietly. "I'd like it back." Voss held it a moment longer, watching her face for some flash of anger he could laugh at. She gave him nothing. So he let it drop. Not gently. Not by accident. He opened his hand and let the watch fall, hitting the tile floor with a sharp, small crack that seemed to echo through the room. A few officers chuckled. Sloane knelt down slowly and picked it up. The glass across the face now carried a thin, jagged line right beneath the hands. She said nothing. She only closed her palm around it and stood back up. "Guess it wasn't built for the real world either," Voss said, already turning away. Sloane slipped the watch back into her pocket. He lingered a moment longer, like he was waiting for a reaction that never came. Then walked off toward the break room, muttering something to another officer that made them both laugh. Sloane sat down at her desk and began to work. Hour after hour, she sorted through old case files, most of them meaningless. Parking disputes, noise complaints, a stolen bicycle from 3 summers ago. But she watched everything as she worked. She watched how officers spoke to each other. She watched who Voss joked with and who flinched when he walked by. She watched how Dorothy answered every phone call with the same patient warmth, no matter how the day was going. She was not just filing paperwork. She was learning the shape of this place, the way water finds every crack in a foundation before a house finally falls. Around 11, she caught her own reflection in the darkened window of the filing room. A young woman sitting very still, hands steady despite everything. She thought of her father and how many mornings he must have sat behind a desk just like this one, learning the same quiet lessons. Patience first, judgment second, action only when it truly mattered. She reached into her pocket, felt the small crack now running across the watch face, and let her hand rest there a moment before going back to work. Around noon, Sloane took her lunch break outside, sitting on a bench near the parking lot. A young officer sat down a few feet away. Dark hair, an easy smile, the kind of face that hadn't yet been worn down by the job. His name tag read Sinclair. "Wyatt Sinclair," he said, offering a hand. "You're new too, right?" "Sloane Hart," she said, shaking it. "Voss giving you a hard time?" She considered the question a moment. "He's giving me an education," she said finally. Wyatt laughed, a little surprised by the answer. "That's one way to put it." They sat in silence a moment, the autumn air cool against their faces. "Can I ask you something?" Wyatt said. "Go ahead." "Doesn't it bother you the way he talks to you?" Sloane looked out toward the street where an old man was walking his dog slowly past the diner. "I'm not here to make a scene," she said quietly. "But I'm not here to run either." Wyatt looked at her a long moment, like he was trying to understand something he couldn't quite name. "That's a strange way to talk on a first day," he said. Sloane almost smiled. "I've had a lot of first days," she said. I didn't press further, but he noticed the way she said it. Like there was a whole life behind those 5 words that she wasn't ready to share yet. "Well," he said, standing and brushing off his uniform. "For what it's worth, not everybody in there is like Voss." "I noticed," Sloane said. "Thank you, Wyatt." He gave her a small nod and walked back toward the station, leaving her alone with the quiet hum of the town around her. That afternoon, Captain Pruitt sent her down to the records room in the basement. Old cases closed for decades sat in metal filing cabinets that hadn't been touched in years. Someone needed to digitize the important ones before the county audit. It was cold down there. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Sloane worked methodically cabinet by cabinet, pulling old folders and checking the labels. Then her hand stopped. A folder near the back of the third drawer. The label was faded, but still let. Case number 1147. Hart Walter. Closed. Accidental. Her breath caught in her chest. She stood there a long moment, staring at her father's name typed on a piece of paper in a basement that smelled like dust and old metal. She had read the official report 100 times before. She knew every word of it by heart. But there was something different about seeing it here in this building, in this drawer, 12 years after it happened. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Photographs of a wrecked car on a rural road. A brief incident summary. A signature at the bottom of the page authorizing the case closure. She read the name of the signing officer. She had seen it before in copies she had studied for years. But something about seeing it here, in the original file in this building, where that man still worked every day, made her stomach turn in a way she hadn't expected. She closed the folder gently and placed it back exactly where she found it. Not yet, she told herself, not until she had more. She had learned patience the hard way. She would not throw it away now. She stood there another long moment, one hand pressed flat against the cool metal of the cabinet, steadying herself before climbing back up the narrow stairs, upstairs unseen by anyone. A small security camera in the hallway had caught her standing frozen in the doorway of the records room, her hand pressed against the frame. Dorothy Byrne watched the footage later that evening from the dispatch monitor more out of habit than suspicion. She had watched thousands of hours of that same grainy footage over the years. But something about the way that young woman stood still and quiet hand pressed to her chest made Dorothy pause the screen. She leaned closer. There was something in the eyes. The stillness of them. The way she seemed to be holding something in the exact same way a man Dorothy had known once many years ago used to hold things in. No, Dorothy whispered to herself. It can't be. She sat there a long moment, the old office quiet around her, before shaking her head and pressing play again. Some ghosts, she thought, were better left resting, at least for now. She poured herself another cup of coffee and told herself it was nothing. Just an old woman seeing faces where there weren't any. But she left the monitor paused a moment longer than she needed to, just looking at that stillness in the eyes. Day one ended quietly. Sloane drove back to the small rented house on the edge of town, the porch light flickering slightly as she climbed the steps. Inside, she set her keys on the counter and took the pocket watch from her jacket, placing it gently on the table. She sat down across from it, just looking at the worn silver case for a long time. I found it, Dad, she said quietly to no one. I found the file. The house said nothing back, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of wind against the windows. She thought about Voss's voice that morning. Guess it wasn't built for the real world either. She thought about the signature at the bottom of that old report. She ran her thumb slowly along the new crack in the glass, the same way she used to trace the engraving on the back. Somewhere in this town, 12 years of silence had been carefully built, brick by people who thought no one would ever come looking. They had no idea who was coming. She made herself a simple dinner, ate it standing at the counter, and did not turn on the television. She wanted the quiet. She thought about her father's old habit of writing in a small notebook every night before bed. Just a few lines, nothing dramatic. Things he was grateful for. Things he still needed to do. She had never kept that habit herself. But tonight, for the first time in years, she found a scrap of paper and wrote 2 lines before setting it aside. Found his file, still standing. Before turning in for the night, she took one more drive. She had not planned it. Her hands simply turned the wheel that direction on their own, out past the edge of town, down a quiet street lined with maple trees. The house was still there, smaller than she remembered. A different family lived there now, their porch light glowing warm against the early evening dark. A child's bicycle lying on its side in the front yard. She did not stop the car. She only slowed just enough to remember standing on that same porch as a little girl waving to her father as his cruiser pulled away each morning. A mile further, she turned into the small cemetery on the edge of town. gravel crunching softly beneath her tires. She had not planned to visit, but her feet carried her there anyway, past rows of quiet headstones until she stood before a simple granite marker. Walter James Hart, beloved husband and father, Chief of Police Millbrook. She knelt down, brushing a few fallen leaves from the base of the stone. "I made it back," she said quietly. "It took me 12 years, but I made it back." The evening wind moved gently through the trees above her, the only answer the town seemed willing to give. "I found your file today," she continued. "I know you were close to something. I'm going to finish it, Dad, whatever it costs." She stayed a few minutes longer, until the sky had turned fully dark, before rising and walking back to her car. She did not cry. She had done enough of that over the years. Tonight she simply felt steadier, like something long unfinished had quietly begun again. She drove home slowly, the streetlights of Millbrook passing over her windshield one by one, and let herself into the small rented house waiting at the end of a quiet street. She turned off the light and went to bed early. Tomorrow was only day 2. Day 2 started the same way most days start in a small town, quietly, predictably. Except that Sergeant Voss had decided somewhere between his morning coffee and his first cigarette break that the new girl needed a real taste of the job. "You're on nights," he told her, tossing a schedule sheet onto her desk. "Solo patrol coverage. Dispatch will radio if anything comes up." It wasn't standard procedure to put a rookie alone on night patrol without a partner. Sloane knew that. She said nothing about it. "Understood, Sergeant." Voss smirked, clearly expecting some pushback that never came. "Try not to get lost," he said, walking away. Wyatt caught her eye from across the room, giving a small shake of his head, like he wanted to say something but thought better of it, before her shift began that evening. Sloane stopped at the diner on Main Street for an early dinner. The bell above the door chimed as she walked in. A handful of regulars sat scattered along the counter, coffee cups steaming in front of them, the smell of bacon and fresh bread filling the small room. An older waitress with a kind, weathered face set a menu in front of her. "You're the new officer," the waitress said. Not really a question. News travels fast around here. "Guess it does," Sloane said. "I'm Peg," the waitress said. "Been serving coffee in this town longer than most of these men have been driving." She nodded toward the counter where 2 older men in overalls sat chuckling over something. "Don't let Voss get to you," Peg added, lowering her voice slightly. "He talks big, always has. But this town's had good chiefs before. It'll have one again." Sloane looked up, something flickering behind her calm expression. "You remember the old chief," she said carefully. "Walter Hart." Peg's face softened, memory passing gently across it. "Best man this town ever had. Wear that badge," she said. "Used to come in every Sunday after church, order the same plate of eggs, leave the same tip every single time. Terrible thing, what happened to him." "Terrible," Sloane agreed quietly. "Some folks around here still don't believe it was really an accident," Peg said, glancing briefly toward the window, as if checking who might be listening. "But that's old talk. Best left alone, most people say." "Why's that?" Peg shrugged, wiping down the counter with a worn cloth. "Because asking questions in a town this small has a way of costing people things," she said. "Jobs, friendships, sometimes more." She said it lightly, almost like a joke, but something in her eyes carried more weight than the words themselves. Sloane nodded slowly, filing the warning away the same careful way she filed everything else. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. Peg waved a hand as if brushing the whole conversation aside. "Just an old woman talking too much. Pay me no mind." But she topped off Sloane's coffee anyway, a small, quiet kindness offered without another word. Sloane ate her dinner slowly, listening to the quiet chatter around her, filing away every small detail the way she had learned to do years ago. By the time she left, the sun was beginning to set behind the grain silo at the edge of town, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and violet. She sat in her car a moment, thinking about Peg's words. Asking questions has a way of costing people things. She started the engine and drove toward the station for her night shift. the words settling quietly into the same place she kept everything else that mattered. That night, just past 11, a call came through dispatch. A disturbance outside the Millbrook Tavern. A man heavily intoxicated shouting at customers, refusing to leave. Sloane was the only unit close enough to respond. She arrived to find a large man in his 40s, standing in the middle of the parking lot, swaying slightly, shouting incoherent threats at a group of frightened bystanders. A bouncer stood nearby, clearly unsure what to do, keeping his distance. Sloane stepped out of her cruiser slowly. She didn't reach for anything. She didn't raise her voice. "Sir," she said calmly, "my name is Officer Hart. I'd like to talk with you for a moment." The man turned toward her eyes, glassy fists clenched. "You gonna arrest me?" he slurred. "Little girl like you gonna arrest me?" "I'm not here to arrest anyone," she said, taking one slow step closer, keeping her hands visible and open. "I just want everyone to get home safe tonight. That includes you." Something in her voice calmed and even seemed to catch him off guard. He blinked at her. "Nobody talks to me like that," he muttered, less certain now. "I'm talking to you like a person," Sloane said, "because that's what you are." The man's shoulders dropped slightly. The anger in his eyes flickered, replaced for a moment by something closer to exhaustion. I had a bad night," he said quietly. "I understand," Sloane said. "Why don't we get you somewhere safe? I can call someone to come get you. No arrest, no paperwork, just getting you home." It took a few more minutes of quiet, patient conversation. But eventually the man nodded and let her walk him to the curb, where he sat down heavily and waited for his brother to arrive. No shouting, no struggle, no one hurt. The bouncer, who had watched the whole thing from a distance, walked over afterward. "I've seen guys twice your size get that man in cuffs and still end up wrestling him to the ground," he said. "How'd you do that?" Sloane just shrugged. "People aren't looking for a fight," she said. "Most of the time they're just looking for someone to listen." The bouncer studied her a moment longer, like he was trying to decide if she was serious. "Well," he said finally, "you've got a gift most folks around here never bothered to learn." "It's not a gift," Sloane said. "It's just practice. Anyone can learn to listen if they're willing to slow down long enough to try." She got back into her cruiser, radioed in that the scene was clear, and sat a moment in the quiet before driving off the streetlights, sliding past her window one by one. Wyatt had heard about the call over the radio and driven by just in time to see the tail end of it, the man sitting calmly on the curb, waiting for his ride. He watched Sloane get back into her cruiser, completely unshaken, like she had just finished a routine traffic stop. Something about the way she had handled it stuck with him. It wasn't textbook rookie behavior. It was too smooth, too practiced. The next morning, back at the station, he mentioned it quietly to another officer during coffee. "You hear about Hart last night? Solo call, drunk and disorderly, outside the tavern. She talked the guy down in like 10 minutes. No cuffs, no backup." The other officer raised an eyebrow. "Rookie did that." "That's what I'm saying," Wyatt said. "Doesn't add up." Voss, walking by at that exact moment, overheard the tail end of it. "Don't let a lucky night fool you," he said, cutting in. "Beginner's luck runs out fast around here." But even as he said it, something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of something uneasy. He didn't like being upstaged. Especially not by a rookie he had written off on day one. Especially not by a woman. He walked away a little faster than usual and did not look back. That afternoon, an elderly woman walked into the station clutching a worn leather purse against her chest. Her name was Ruth Whitcomb. 78 years old, small and thin, with kind eyes that were red-rimmed from crying. She approached the front desk where Dorothy greeted her gently. "Ruth, honey, what's wrong?" "I need to speak to someone," Ruth said, her voice trembling. I think I've been robbed." Dorothy's face softened immediately. She had known Ruth for years, ever since Ruth's husband used to bring donuts to the station every Friday morning back before he passed. "Come sit down," Dorothy said, guiding her to a chair. "I'll get someone to help you right away." Voss happened to be the closest officer in the bullpen. Dorothy called him over. He walked toward Ruth slowly, clearly, already annoyed at the interruption to his afternoon. "What's the problem?" he asked, not bothering to sit down. Ruth wiped her eyes with a tissue. "Someone called me. Said they were from my bank, said there was fraud on my account, and I needed to transfer my savings to a safe account right away to protect it." Voss sighed audibly. "And you gave them your account information?" Ruth nodded, ashamed. "They sounded so official. They knew my husband's name. They knew things about my account. I didn't think." "How much did you lose?" Voss asked flatly. "All of it," Ruth whispered. "My whole savings. 22 years of it." For a moment there was silence. Then Voss let out a short, humorless laugh. "Ma'am, I hate to say it, but this happens every week," he said. "Elderly folks giving their information to strangers on the phone. Nothing we can really do about it after the money's already gone." Ruth's lower lip trembled. "Isn't there something?" "Look," Voss said, cutting her off, his voice rising with impatience. "If people would just learn to hang up the phone when strangers ask for their bank information, we wouldn't have this problem. It's not really police business. It's more of a personal responsibility issue." The words landed like a slap, even before any hand was raised. Ruth's shoulders folded inward like she was trying to make herself smaller. Across the room, Sloane had been organizing files at a nearby desk. She had heard every word. She stood up. "Sergeant," Sloane said, her voice calm, but clear enough to carry across the room. Voss turned, clearly irritated at the interruption. "What?" Sloane walked over, stopping a respectful distance from Ruth, and knelt slightly so she was eye level with her. "Mrs. Whitcomb," she said gently, "I'm so sorry this happened to you. This is not your fault. These scams are designed by professionals, specifically to fool good, trusting people. It happens to smart people every single day." "Beaufort." Ruth looked up at her eyes, red and grateful, like no one had said something so simple to her in a long time. Sloane turned to Voss. "Sergeant, when someone walks in here in tears because they've lost their life savings, our job isn't to decide whether they deserve help," she said. "Our job is to help." The room went quiet. A few officers nearby glanced up from their desks, sensing the shift in the air. Voss's face reddened. "You've been here 2 days," he said low and sharp. "Don't tell me how to do my job." "I'm not telling you how to do your job, man," Sloane said evenly. "I'm asking you to do it." For a long moment, Voss just stared at her, jaw tight. Then, in a swift, sudden motion, he reached down and grabbed the small notebook sitting on the edge of Sloane's desk, the one she had been using to jot down notes all week. He threw it hard onto the floor, papers scattering right in front of Ruth. "That's what happens," he said loudly, "when rookies forget their place." Ruth flinched, pulling back in her chair, her hands trembling. The whole room had gone silent. A few officers looked away, uncomfortable, unwilling to get involved. Sloane knelt down slowly and began gathering the scattered papers one by one, without a word. It was in that silence that Voss's frustration finally boiled over completely. Maybe it was 2 days of quiet defiance. Maybe it was the whispers about the tavern call. Maybe it was simply that, for the first time in years, someone in that building wasn't afraid of him. Whatever the reason, as Sloane rose back to her feet, notebook in hand, Voss's arm moved before his mind seemed to catch up with it. The slap landed across her cheek, sharp and sudden, the sound of it cracking through the quiet room like a gunshot. A collective gasp rippled through the bullpen. Ruth let out a small cry, hands flying to her mouth. Dorothy stood up so fast her chair rolled backward and hit the wall behind her. Wyatt, standing near the coffee machine, froze completely, his cup halfway to his lips. Sloane's head had turned slightly with the force of the blow. A faint red mark bloomed across her cheek, but she did not cry out. She did not stumble. She did not raise a hand in return. She simply turned her head back slowly and looked directly into Voss's eyes. The room was utterly silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Voss himself looked almost startled by what he had just done. His hand still raised slightly, his breathing quick and shallow. Sloane held his gaze a long moment. Then, in a voice quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear it, but steady as stone, she said the only words she would say on the matter that day. Some men mistake silence for weakness, she said. That's usually the last mistake they make. She bent down, picked up the last scattered paper from the floor, and placed it gently back on her desk. Then she turned to Ruth, who was still trembling in her chair, tears streaming silently down her face. Sloane knelt beside her again, her voice soft now, all the sharpness gone. "Mrs. Whitcomb," she said, "I promise you I will look into this myself. Personally. You are not going to be forgotten." Ruth reached out with a shaking hand and gently took Sloane's fingers in her own. "Thank you," she whispered. Voss stood there a moment longer, his face pale now, as if some part of him already understood. He had crossed a line that couldn't easily be uncrossed. He muttered something about paperwork and walked quickly towards the break room, avoiding every eye in the bullpen on his way out. Captain Pruitt, who had missed the entire incident behind his closed office door, stepped out moments later, drawn by the sudden silence in a room usually full of noise. "What happened out here?" he asked, looking around at the stunned faces. No one answered right away. Dorothy finally spoke, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Sergeant Voss struck Officer Hart," she said, "in front of everyone." Pruitt's eyes moved to Sloane, to the faint red mark still visible on her cheek. For a brief moment, something passed between them, a silent understanding that went far deeper than anyone else in that room could know. Pruitt knew exactly who she really was. He knew this moment would matter far more than anyone here yet realized. But he also knew he could not break the arrangement. Not yet. Not with 9 days still on the clock and a hearing that would decide the fate of this entire department. "Officer Hart," he said carefully. "My office. Now." Sloane nodded once, gave Ruth's hand a final gentle squeeze, and stood. As she walked past the rows of silent watching officers, no one said a word. But something in the room had shifted. Something that could not be undone. For the first time, they were starting to wonder who this quiet woman really was. Inside his office, Pruitt closed the door and simply looked at her for a long moment. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, dropping the formal tone. "I'm fine," Sloane said. "It's not the first time someone's tried to make me smaller than I am." Pruitt sat heavily in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "This complicates things," he said. "I should be filing a report right now, suspending him, following procedure." "But you can't," Sloane said. "Not without questions. Not without someone asking why the captain is protecting a rookie so carefully." Pruitt nodded, clearly torn. 7 days left, he said. "I need you to hold on 7 more days." Sloane touched her cheek lightly, feeling the warmth already rising there. "I've waited 12 years for this town to tell the truth," she said. "I can wait 7 more days." Pruitt studied her, something like admiration crossing his tired face. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. "I mean that." Sloane's eyes softened just slightly. "Thank you, Captain," she said. "I needed to hear that today." Out at the dispatch desk, long after most of the day shift had gone home, Dorothy Burns sat alone, the station quiet around her, except for the soft static of the radio. She kept replaying the sound of that slap in her mind. The way the room had gone silent. The way that young officer had barely flinched, as if she had trained her whole life not to. Dorothy thought of Walter Hart again, the way she had every day since that stillness, and Sloane's eyes had first caught her attention. She thought of the small cassette tape still hidden in a drawer at her own house, wrapped carefully in an old handkerchief untouched for 12 long years. She had told herself every year since that it was safer left where it was, that speaking up would only cost her the job she loved and the pension she had earned. But watching Sloane Hart walk out of that bullpen with her head held high, a red mark blooming across her cheek, something in Dorothy's chest had shifted. Maybe silence had already cost this town enough. She did not decide anything that night. She simply sat with the thought a while longer than usual before locking up the station and driving home under a sky full of quiet watching stars. That evening, Sloane sat once again in her small rented house, the porch light humming softly outside. She held a bag of ice against her cheek with one hand and turned the silver pocket watch over slowly in the other. The crack in the glass caught the lamplight, a thin silver line running beneath the hands. She traced it gently with her thumb. 9 days. she whispered to herself. Now 7. She thought about Ruth's trembling hands, about the silence in that room when no one had stepped in to stop what was happening, about the folder in the basement with her father's name typed across the front. She thought about patience and how much of it her father used to carry back when he still walked those same hallways. Still believed that doing the right thing quietly was enough. It hadn't been enough for him. She wondered for just a moment if it would be enough for her. She thought about Wyatt's small nod of concern across the bullpen, about Dorothy's chair hitting the wall, about the way even the silence in that room, awful as it was, had at least proven one thing. Not everyone in this building had stopped caring. Not everyone had gone numb to what was right and wrong. There was still something worth saving in Millbrook. She simply had to make sure the truth reached it before the town ran out of time. She thought, too, about Peg at the diner and her quiet warning. Asking questions has a way of costing people things. Her father had asked questions anyway. It had cost him everything. She was not afraid of that same cost. She had made her peace with it long before she ever drove into this town. What frightened her more was the thought of failing him twice, once by losing him, and once more by not finishing what he started. She set the watch down gently on the table, closed her eyes, and made herself a quiet promise. Whatever this town had buried 12 years ago, whatever truth it had tried so hard to forget, she was going to bring it back into the light. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with patience and proof, and the same quiet strength that had been engraved on that old watch long before she was born. She thought briefly about calling Mayor Whitfield that night just to hear a familiar voice, but she decided against it. Some things were hers, to carry alone at least for now. Instead, she picked up the scrap of paper from the night before and added one more line beneath the first two. Struck today, still standing, still watching. She folded the paper, tucked it into a drawer beside the bed, and turned off the light. Outside, Millbrook settled into its usual quiet porch lights, flickering off one by one along the street, the church bell marking 10 o'clock somewhere in the distance. Nobody in that small town yet understood how much was about to change. Tomorrow would bring day 3. And day 3, though she did not know it yet, would begin to crack open everything Millbrook had spent 12 long years trying to keep hidden. Some silences last for years. They sit quietly in a drawer or in the back of someone's mind, waiting for the right person to finally ask the right question. For 12 years, Millbrook had kept one of those silences buried. It took a bruised cheek, a cracked watch, and one very patient woman to start pulling it back into the light. Day 3 had ended with a slap heard across an entire police station. Day 4 would begin with a secret finally spoken out loud. Sloane arrived early that morning before most of the day shift had even clocked in. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a faint yellow shadow. She had covered it lightly with makeup, not to hide what happened, but because she did not want it to be the story people talked about that day. She had barely slept the night before, replaying the sound of that slap over and over, along with the sound of the crack in her father's watch hitting the floor 2 days earlier. 2 small, sharp sounds that had somehow changed everything about how this town looked at her. She had decided somewhere around 3 in the morning that she would not let either sound define her time here. Only the truth would do that. She wanted to work. Dorothy was already at her desk, sipping coffee from a chipped mug that read, "World's Okayest Grandma." She looked up when Sloane walked in, and this time she did not look away. "Officer Hart," Dorothy said quietly, "do you have a few minutes before your shift starts?" Sloane paused. Something in the older woman's voice was different today. Careful, deliberate. "Of course," Sloane said. Dorothy glanced around the lobby, checking that no one else was within earshot. "Not here," she said. "Come with me." They walked together to a small break room in the back of the building, the kind with a stained coffee pot and a table that wobbled slightly on uneven legs. Dorothy closed the door behind them. For a long moment, she just looked at Sloane, studying her face, the way someone studies an old photograph, searching for a resemblance they are almost afraid to find. "I need to ask you something," Dorothy said, "and I need you to be honest with me." Sloane nodded slowly. "What's your father's name?" The question hit the air like a stone dropped into still water. Sloane felt her chest tighten. She had not expected it. Not yet. Not this soon. She could have lied. She had trained herself to deflect questions like this for years. But something in Dorothy's eyes told her that lying would be a mistake. "Walter," Sloane said quietly. "Walter Hart?" Dorothy's hand came up to her mouth. Her eyes filled instantly with tears. "I knew it," she whispered. "The moment you walked through that door, I knew it. You have his eyes. That same stillness." Sloane swallowed hard. "You knew my father." "I worked dispatch here for 35 years, Dorothy said, her voice trembling. "Walter Hart trained half the officers who used to walk these halls. He was the finest chief this department ever had." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "And they let his death get buried like it was nothing," she said. "Like he was nothing." Sloane sat down slowly at the wobbly table, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "Tell me," she said. "Please, tell me what you know." Dorothy sat across from her, folding her hands tightly together as if she were holding herself in place. "Your father was investigating something," she began. "In the months before he died. He didn't talk about it openly, but I could tell something was wrong. He started coming in early, staying late, locking his office door when he used to always leave it open." "Investigating what?" "There were rumors from none," Dorothy said, "about a group of officers taking payoffs. Looking the other way on certain accidents, certain traffic stops, certain cases that involved people with money and connections." Sloane's jaw tightened. "He never told me the details," Dorothy continued. "He was careful about that. Said the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone would be. But I remember the last week before it happened. He seemed different. Nervous, but relieved too. Like he was close to something." "Close to proving it," Sloane said quietly. Dorothy nodded. "The night he died," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He called dispatch just before it happened. Said he was on his way to meet someone. A witness, I think. He sounded rushed, almost scared." Sloane leaned forward. "What did he say exactly?" "I don't remember every word," Dorothy admitted. "It's been 12 years. But I remember one thing clearly. He said, if anything happens to me tonight, make sure the tape gets to someone who will listen." The room went very quiet. "What tape?" Sloane asked. Dorothy reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small object wrapped carefully in a handkerchief. She set it gently on the table between them. "An old cassette tape. I've kept this in my house for 12 years, Dorothy said. "I was afraid to bring it in. Afraid of who might still be here. Afraid no one would believe an old dispatcher over the word of officers everyone respected." Sloane stared at the tape like it was something fragile enough to shatter. "Is this the recording from that night?" "Part of it," Dorothy said. "It's damaged. The tape warped somehow years ago, before I even understood how important it might be. There's a section in the middle that's just static, but the beginning and the end are still there." Sloane picked it up carefully, cradling it in both hands, like it weighed far more than a few ounces of plastic and tape. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." Dorothy reached across the table and gently placed her hand over Sloane's. "I think I do," she said. "You didn't come back to this town by accident, did you?" Sloane looked up, meeting her eyes fully for the first time. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't." "Why now?" Sloane asked. "Why tell me this today and not on my first day?" Dorothy considered the question a long moment. "Because on your first day you were just a rookie," she said. "Yesterday I watched a grown man strike you across the face for standing up for an old woman, and you didn't even blink." She reached out and gently touched the small crack, still visible on the watch, peeking from Sloane's pocket. "That's when I knew," Dorothy said. "Whatever brought you back to this town, it's bigger than a badge. It's bigger than a job." Sloane looked down at the tape resting in her palm. "My father used to say something," she said quietly, "that the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs someone patient enough to wait for it." He used to say that to me too, Dorothy said, smiling through fresh tears. Sounds like you were listening. After Sloane left the break room that morning, Dorothy sat alone a while longer, her hands still trembling faintly around her coffee mug. She thought about the 12 years she had carried that tape, hidden in a drawer beneath old photographs and Christmas cards, never quite able to throw it away, never quite brave enough to bring it forward. She thought about her late husband, gone 8 years now, who used to tell her she worried too much about things that were not hers to fix. Some things are exactly ours to fix, Harold, she thought, answering him quietly in her mind, the way she often did when the station grew too quiet. We just don't always find the courage in time. She had found it today. 12 years late, but found all the same. A young officer walked past the break room door, offering a polite good morning. Dorothy returned the greeting warmly, tucking her fear carefully back beneath the same steady composure she had worn every day for 35 years. Whatever came next, she told herself she would face it the same way Walter Hart always had. Quietly, steadily, without ever needing anyone's permission to do what was right. Later that same afternoon, once her shift had ended, Sloane drove out to Ruth Whitcomb's small house on the edge of town. A modest place with a wraparound porch and a garden gone slightly wild with autumn weeds. She had not been assigned this visit. She had come on her own time, exactly as she had promised. Ruth answered the door slowly, surprise softening into warmth when she saw who it was. Officer Hart, she said. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. I told you I'd look into things myself, Sloane said. I meant it. Ruth invited her in, and they sat together at a small kitchen table, a plate of shortbread cookies between them that Ruth insisted Sloane try twice before she would let the conversation continue. Can you walk me through exactly what happened? Sloane asked gently. Every detail, even the ones that seem unimportant. Ruth folded her hands, thinking back carefully. The man on the phone knew things, she said. My husband's name, the bank I use. Even mentioned my late husband's old badge number, like he was trying to prove he was official. Mas, Sloane's pen stopped moving. Your husband had a badge number. He worked dispatch here for a short while years ago before he passed, Ruth said. Alongside Dorothy, actually. They were dear friends. Sloane felt something shift quietly into place. Do you still have the phone number that called you? She asked. Ruth nodded and retrieved a small notepad from beside the telephone, the number written in careful shaking handwriting. Sloane copied it down, along with the approximate time of the call and the exact wording Ruth remembered the caller using. This might not be the only case like yours, Sloane said carefully. I think whoever is behind this has been doing it for a long time and knows this town very well. Ruth's face grew troubled. You think it's someone local? I think it's someone who knows exactly which doors to knock on, Sloane said, and which ones nobody bothers checking anymore. Before she left, Ruth reached out and took her hand. Whatever happened to you in that station the other day? Ruth said quietly. I want you to know an old woman noticed. And an old woman won't forget it. Sloane squeezed her hand gently. Thank you, Mrs. Whitcomb. That means more than you know. At the door, Ruth paused a moment longer, studying Sloane's face with a strange, thoughtful expression. You have kind eyes, Ruth said. The same kind your father had come to think of it. I only met him a handful of times, but I never forgot that. Sloane's breath caught just slightly. Thank you, she managed. That means more than you could possibly know. She drove home that evening, with the phone number tucked carefully into her notebook on more small piece of a puzzle, slowly, steadily beginning to take a shape she did not yet fully understand. Later that night, at her kitchen table, she ran the number through a records database she still had limited access to, through her old position with the State Oversight Board. The number traced back to a prepaid phone purchased with cash registered under no real name at all. But the store where it had been purchased sat only a few miles outside Millbrook in a small strip mall she recognized from her own childhood, back when her father used to take her there for ice cream on Sunday afternoons. Someone close to this town, she realized. Not some faceless stranger operating from a call center 1,000 miles away. Someone who knew these streets, These people, these old wounds still healing beneath the surface. She thought back to Peg's warning at the diner and to the strange uneasy feeling that had settled over her ever since. This town's secrets, it seemed, were not layered in the distant past alone. Some of them were still very much alive, walking these same streets in daylight, greeting neighbors by name. She added the detail to her notebook, closed it carefully, and set it beside the small cracked watch on her nightstand before finally allowing herself to sleep. That same morning, while Sloane sat with Dorothy in the break room, Captain Pruitt was in his office reviewing paperwork about a scam operation that had been targeting elderly residents across 3 counties. Reports had come in over the past year. Phone calls impersonating bank officials, fraudulent requests for account transfers, victims losing their life savings in a matter of minutes. He spread the case files across his desk, noting the pattern more clearly than he ever had before. Nearly every victim was over 70. Nearly everyone lived alone or had recently lost a spouse. Nearly every call came from a different prepaid number, each one used only once then abandoned. Whoever ran this operation understood exactly how to find the loneliest, most trusting people in 3 separate counties, and exactly how to disappear the moment the money moved. Ruth Whitcomb's case was simply the newest one on a growing pile. Pruitt rubbed his tired eyes and set the file aside. He had a feeling he couldn't quite explain, that these cases connected to something deeper, something the department had never properly investigated. He just didn't yet know how deep that something went. He thought about this message he had sent the mayor the day before. "She's here. It begins." He wondered, not for the first time, if he had underestimated exactly how much was about to unravel. Later that day, Sloane found a quiet moment at her desk to begin her own investigation. She had learned over her years, working with the State Oversight Board, how to read old case files with a careful, patient eye. She knew how to spot inconsistencies, small details that didn't quite line up. She pulled the digital duty logs from 12 years earlier, the ones the department had only recently begun scanning into their system. She cross-referenced the date of her father's accident with the official duty roster from that night. According to the roster officer, Garrett Voss, not yet a sergeant back then, had been assigned to a different sector of town entirely that evening. Nowhere near the rural road where the accident occurred. But the case file she had found earlier in the basement told a different story. The signature authorizing the closure of the case, confirming the scene had been properly processed, belonged to Officer G. Voss. Sloane sat back slowly in her chair. Either the duty roster was wrong, or Voss had been somewhere he was never supposed to be that night, and had signed his name to a story that made sure no one would ever ask why. She wrote the discrepancy down in a small private notebook, one she had begun keeping since arriving in Millbrook, separate from the notebook Voss had thrown to the floor days earlier. Some things she had learned were safer written twice. Wyatt Sinclair had never considered himself the suspicious type. He liked his job. He liked the quiet rhythm of small-town patrol, the familiar faces, the sense that most days ended exactly the way they began. But something about the past week had unsettled that rhythm entirely. He kept thinking about the tavern call, about the robbery, about the calm, practiced way Sloane Hart had handled both, like someone who had trained for exactly these moments long before she ever set foot in Millbrook. And he kept thinking about Voss, the way the sergeant's mood had shifted day by day from smug amusement to something tighter, something nervous, hidden just beneath the surface. That evening, after his shift ended, Wyatt found himself lingering near the records room longer than he needed to, telling himself he was simply filing a report. He noticed the sign-in sheet for evidence storage sitting slightly askew on the shelf, as if someone had replaced it in a hurry. He flipped back a few pages, comparing handwriting, comparing dates. Something about the entries from 2 nights earlier looked different, rushed, the ink slightly darker, as if written all at once rather than throughout a normal day. He did not know what it meant. Not yet. But he took a photograph of the page, with his phone, tucked it away, and told no one. Not because he didn't trust his fellow officers, but because, for the first time in his career, he wasn't entirely sure who in that building he could trust at all. She did not confront him. Not yet. She had learned through years of careful investigative work that confronting someone too early only gave them time to cover their tracks further. Instead, she kept working, kept watching, kept gathering small, quiet pieces of a puzzle slowly taking shape. That evening, she drove out to the edge of town, following the same rural road marked in the old accident report. She parked near an old bend in the road, where a faded guardrail still bore a slight dent, 12 years old, now rusted and weathered by time. She stood there a long moment, the wind moving softly through the tall grass on either side of the road. She crouched down near the guardrail, running her fingers along the old weathered metal, imagining the sound of impact that must have echoed here, once in the dark, on a night no one else had been around to witness. "I'm close, Dad," she whispered. "I promise I'm close." A truck passed slowly on the road behind her, the driver glancing curiously at the young woman crouched beside the guardrail in the fading light. She did not turn to look. She simply stayed there a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around her before rising and walking back to her car. Later that same evening, Sloane's phone rang. Mayor Whitfield's name appeared on the screen. She answered from her car still parked near the quiet bend in the road. "I heard about the robbery," the mayor said, her voice warm with relief. "And I heard about the tavern call before that. You're making quite an impression, Officer Hart." "I'm just doing the job," Sloane said. "You're doing more than that," the mayor replied. "How are you holding up, truly?" Sloane hesitated, glancing out at the darkening field beside the road. "Dorothy Byrne knew my father," she said quietly. "She kept a recording from the night he died. I have it now." The line went silent a moment. "That's the break we needed," the mayor finally said. "Sloane, listen to me carefully. Whatever you find, document everything. Chain of custody matters more now than it ever has. If this reaches the hearing, it needs to hold up." "I understand." "And be careful," the mayor added, her voice softening. "If someone in that department was willing to falsify a report 12 years ago, they may still be willing to do far worse to protect that secret today." Sloane looked down at the small crack in her father's watch, catching the last light of the evening sun. "I know exactly what this town is capable of hiding," she said quietly. "I grew up watching it happen. I don't intend to let it happen again." The mayor was quiet a moment. "The hearing is getting close," she said. "I believe in you, Sloane. Your father would too." Sloane ended the call and sat there a while longer, the field around her, slowly disappearing into darkness before finally starting the engine and driving home. Day 5 brought a very different kind of test. Just after 2 in the afternoon, dispatch received an urgent call. An armed robbery in progress at a convenience store on the edge of town, not far from the elementary school. Dorothy's voice crackled over the radio, tighter than usual. "All units respond. Possible hostage situation. Repeat, possible hostage situation." Sloane and Wyatt were the closest units and arrived within minutes of each other, tires crunching over gravel as they pulled into the small parking lot. Through the storefront glass, they could see a young man in his 20s standing near the register, a handgun trembling in his grip, shouting at the terrified clerk to open the safe. A single customer, an older man clutching a loaf of bread, had frozen near the back aisle, too frightened to move. Voss arrived moments later, taking command of the scene from the parking lot, shouting orders through a bullhorn that seemed to agitate the gunman further rather than calm him. "Put the gun down! Put it down now!" Voss barked. Inside, the young man flinched violently at the sound, grabbing the clerk by the collar and pulling him closer as a shield, his hands shaking even harder around the trigger. Wyatt, positioned near the front entrance, glanced nervously at Sloane. "This is escalating fast," he muttered. Sloane's eyes were steady, calm, focused entirely on the scene unfolding through the glass storefront. Without waiting for instruction, she moved quietly toward the entrance, hands raised slightly empty and visible. "Hart, get back," Voss barked through the bullhorn. "That's an order." She ignored him. She stepped inside slowly, voice low and even. "My name is Sloane," she said, addressing the young man directly, tone calm as still water. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want everyone in this room to go home tonight. That includes you." The young man's eyes darted toward her, wild and frightened. "Stay back," he shouted. "I'll shoot him, I swear I will." "I believe that you might," Sloane said, honestly. But I don't think that's what you actually want. I think you're scared. I think something went very wrong today, and this became the only way out you could see." The young man's hand trembled harder, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice cracking. "You're right," Sloane said gently. "I don't. But I know that right now, in this moment, you still have a choice. And once that gun goes off, that choice disappears forever. For you, for him, for everyone in this room." Long seconds passed. The clerk whimpered softly, still gripped tightly against the young man's chest. Sloane took one small, slow step closer. "Put the gun on the counter," she said quietly, "and we'll walk out of here together. No one has to get hurt today." The young man's breathing grew ragged. His eyes filled suddenly with tears. "I just needed the money," he whispered. "My sister, she's sick and I couldn't." "I understand, sir," Sloane said softly. "But this isn't the way to help her. Let him go. Please." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the young man's grip loosened. He set the gun down gently on the counter and released the clerk, who stumbled backward, gasping. Sloane moved forward, calmly retrieving the weapon and securing it before gently guiding the young man to sit down on the floor, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Near the back aisle, the older customer finally let out the breath he had been holding, setting his loaf of bread down with shaking hands before slipping quietly out the front door. No shots fired, no one hurt. Outside, the entire scene had unfolded in near silence, watched by a small but growing crowd of onlookers, along with Voss, Wyatt, and 2 backup units that had just arrived. When Sloane finally emerged, leading the young man out in handcuffs, calm and composed, the crowd broke into a spontaneous, stunned applause. Wyatt stared at her like he was seeing her for the very first time. "How did you do that?" he said quietly, almost to himself. Sloane simply handed off custody of the suspect to another officer and turned to check on the shaken clerk, kneeling briefly beside him, asking softly if he needed anything before the ambulance arrived. Voss stood off to the side, jaw tight, his bullhorn hanging uselessly at his side. He had watched a rookie he had mocked just days earlier walk calmly into an active hostage situation and resolve it without firing a single shot, while his own shouted commands had only made things worse. The look on his face was no longer one of amusement. It was something closer to fear. That evening, Captain Pruitt called Sloane into his office to formally commend her actions. "That was some of the best crisis negotiation I've seen in 25 years on this force," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Where did you learn to handle a situation like that?" Sloane offered a small, careful smile. "Training, she said simply, "and a lot of practice." Pruitt studied her a long moment, clearly wanting to ask more, but holding himself back, mindful of the arrangement he had promised to keep quiet. "Well," he said instead, "whatever that training was, it clearly worked." Word of the robbery spread quickly through the department that evening. Officers who had barely acknowledged Sloane's presence during her first days suddenly found themselves looking at her differently. Whispers moved through the break room. Rumors began to circulate. "Did you hear about the new..." She talked that guy down like she'd done it 100 times before. There's something not right about her being just a rookie. Voss heard every one of those whispers. And with each one, his sense of control over his own department slipped a little further away. He could not let that stand. That night, alone in his patrol car, Voss sat in the dark parking lot of the station for a long time, staring at nothing, his mind working through a plan. He knew deep down that Sloane Hart was more than she appeared to be. He didn't know exactly what, but he knew with the instinct of a man who had spent decades learning how to survive in the shadows of a broken system that she was a threat. And men like Voss did not wait quietly to see how threats played out. They removed them first. He thought too of a phone call he had made 2 nights earlier, one he had not planned on making to a man he had not spoken to in years. "She's asking questions," he had said into the phone, his voice low. "Then make sure she stops," the voice on the other end had replied. Calm and unbothered, the same way it always had been decades ago, when Voss was young enough to still believe he had a choice. Voss had also noticed Wyatt lingering near the records room the evening before, longer than any routine filing job should have required. He did not know exactly what the young officer had seen, but the uncertainty gnawed at him all the same. One more small crack in a wall he had spent 12 years reinforcing. He decided, sitting there in the dark, that he could not afford to wait and see who else in that building might start asking questions of their own. The next morning, he made his move. Day 6 began with what looked on the surface like a routine inventory check in the evidence storage room. Voss volunteered to conduct it himself, a task he had never once shown interest in during his entire career. He quietly removed a handgun from a locked evidence locker, a weapon connected to an old closed case, and placed it inside a duffel bag he kept in the trunk of his personal vehicle. Then later that same afternoon, he filed an official report. The report claimed that Officer Sloan Hart had been the last person to access that particular evidence locker, according to falsified sign-in logs he had quietly altered the night before. The missing weapon, he claimed, represented a serious breach of evidence protocol, a breach that could only point to negligence or worse, deliberate misconduct on the part of the newest officer in the department. His hands had shaken slightly filling out that false report. 12 years earlier, he had told himself the lie would be the last one. It never had been. Captain Pruitt called Sloan into his office late that afternoon, his face pale and drawn. "Sit down," he said quietly, closing the door behind her. Sloan sat, sensing immediately that something serious was happening. "There's a missing weapon from evidence storage," Pruitt said carefully. "The sign-in logs show your access code was the last one used before it went missing." Sloan's expression remained calm, but her mind was already racing. "I never accessed the evidence room," she said firmly. "Not once since I started." "I believe you," Pruitt said quietly. "But I can't just believe you. Not officially. Not with logs showing otherwise." Sloan leaned forward. "Captain, someone falsified those logs." "I know how this looks," Pruitt said, his voice heavy with an unspoken apology. "And I know the timing is convenient. But procedure requires an official investigation before I can clear you. Until that's completed, department policy requires suspension." Sloan's stomach dropped. "You're suspending me," she said quietly. Not really a question. Pruitt closed his eyes briefly. "I have no choice," he said. "Not without risking exposing everything before we're ready. Not with the state hearing only 3 days away." Sloan understood in that moment the full weight of what was happening. If she pushed back too hard, if she revealed her true identity now, before she had solid proof, it could unravel the entire investigation. It could give whoever was behind this enough warning to disappear, completely taking the truth about her father with them. She had to trust the process, even when the process felt like betrayal. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Until the investigation concludes," Pruitt said. "I'm sorry, Officer Hart. Truly." Sloan nodded slowly and stood smoothing her uniform with steady hands, even though nothing about this moment felt steady at all. 3 days, she said mostly to herself. "I can work with 3 days." After she left Pruitt sat alone at his desk for a long while, the suspension paperwork still open in front of him. He thought about the promise he had made to the mayor and to himself when this whole arrangement began, that he would protect Sloan Hart as best he could while still letting the investigation play out honestly. Signing that suspension had felt like breaking that promise, even though he knew logically it was the only move that kept their plan alive. He picked up his phone and typed a short, careful message to a contact at the State Oversight Board, someone he had worked with years earlier on an unrelated case. He asked quietly, discreetly, whether they had any record of Voss's financial history over the past several months. It was a small thing, barely more than a whisper of an investigation. But it was something. And after 12 years of silence, Pruitt had decided he was done offering this town nothing but silence in return. Word spread through the department within the hour. By the time Sloan walked out of Pruitt's office carrying a small box with her personal items, the entire bullpen had gone quiet. Officers glancing up from their desks with expressions ranging from confusion to open suspicion. Voss stood near the coffee machine arms, crossed a look of quiet satisfaction hidden just beneath a carefully neutral expression. "Shame," he said as she passed. Guess even the best of us slip up sometimes. Sloane did not respond. She simply kept walking, her spine straight, her steps steady. But as she reached the front doors, Wyatt caught up to her, jogging slightly to close the distance. "Sloane, wait," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I don't believe this. Not for a second. I saw how you handled that robbery. I saw how you talked to Ruth Whitcomb. Whoever did this, they're lying." Sloane paused, turning to look at him. There was something steady in his eyes, something honest. "Thank you, Wyatt," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." "What are you going to do?" he asked. Sloane glanced back toward the station, toward the building where her father once walked these same halls with pride 12 long years ago. "I'm going to wait," she said. "Sometimes justice has to travel a long way before it finds its way back home." Wyatt hesitated, then reached out and gently took the small box from her hands, carrying it the rest of the way to her car without a word. At the car, he set the box down carefully in the passenger seat, then pulled out his phone. "There's something else," he said quietly, glancing back toward the station. "I noticed the evidence log looked off 2 nights ago. Rushed handwriting, dates that didn't quite add up. I took a photo just in case." He showed her the image on his screen. Sloane studied it carefully, her expression giving nothing away, though her pulse had quickened. "Don't show this to anyone yet," she said. "Not until I tell you it's safe to." "Why would someone falsify a log like that?" Wyatt asked, "unless they were trying to frame you." Sloane looked at him a long moment. "That's exactly the question I intend to answer," she said. "Just give me a few more days." Wyatt nodded slowly, tucking his phone away, glancing once more toward the station where his fellow officers were still going about their afternoon, unaware of anything that had just passed between them. "Whatever this is," he said, "I hope it's worth it." "It is," Sloane said quietly. "More than you know." It was a small gesture, but it was the first time in 6 days. Anyone in that building had simply helped her carry something without asking for anything in return. By the next morning, news of Sloane's suspension had already reached the diner on Main Street. Peg, wiping down the counter as usual, shook her head at 2 regulars discussing it over their coffee. "Doesn't sit right with me," she said. "That girl helped old Frank Doyle get home safe when he was drunk out of his mind outside the tavern. Now suddenly she's the one in trouble." "Voss says she messed up bad," one of the men said. "Missing evidence or something." "Voss says a lot of things," Peg replied, unimpressed. "Man's been running this town's rumor mill longer than the actual newspaper." Word moved through Millbrook the way it always did in towns that size, quietly over coffee and porch railings and church parking lots. Some of it accurate, most of it not. But underneath the gossip, a quiet current of doubt had begun to form. A handful of townspeople who had watched Sloane Hart handle a dangerous man outside the tavern, with nothing but calm words, who had heard about the way she knelt beside Ruth Whitcomb without a hint of judgment, found themselves unwilling to simply accept the story being told about her. Small towns forget slowly, but they remember exactly the same way. By the end of the week, a small handwritten sign had appeared taped to the diner's front window. Unsigned, simple, and impossible to miss. "We remember who helped Ruth Whitcomb." Peg swore she had no idea who put it there, but she left it hanging in the window anyway, right beside the daily specials for anyone walking past to see. Outside in the parking lot, she paused beside her car, reaching instinctively into her jacket pocket. Her fingers found the familiar shape of the pocket watch, the cracked glass still catching the afternoon light. She held it tightly a moment, closing her eyes. 12 years of silence. 3 days left before a hearing that would decide everything. A damaged tape hidden in an old handkerchief. A signature that didn't match a duty roster. A man growing more desperate by the hour to protect a secret that had already cost one good man his life. She got into her car and sat a long moment before starting the engine. Somewhere behind that station's brick walls, Dorothy Byrne sat quietly at her dispatch desk, clutching a cup of cold coffee, praying silently that she had not just made a terrible mistake by finally speaking the truth out loud. And somewhere in his own home that evening, Garrett Voss poured himself a drink with an unsteady hand, staring at a duffel bag hidden in the back of his closet, wondering if he had finally done enough to protect himself. He had not. Not even close. Because some silences, no matter how carefully they are buried, always find their way back into the light. The station lights had gone dark behind him hours ago, but Voss sat in his car a long while longer staring at nothing. The duffel bag, a dark shape against the closet shelf visible through his own front window. 12 years of careful silence. Cracking piece by piece at the hands of a woman he had once dismissed as nothing more than a rookie in need of a lesson. I was not yet ready to admit it to himself. But some quiet part of him already understood how this story was going to end. Down the street from his darkened house, the same porch lights that had welcomed Sloane on her very first evening in Millbrook still burned softly against the night, steady and patient. The way small towns tend to wait out even their longest storms. That night, Sloane did not go straight home. She drove instead to a quiet park at the edge of town and sat on a bench beneath a large oak tree, its leaves rustling softly overhead in the cool evening air. She took out the small notebook she had started keeping, the one separate from the one Voss had thrown to the floor, and read back through everything she had written so far. The mismatched duty roster. The signature on the old case file. The tape Dorothy had kept safe for 12 years. The prepaid phone traced to a strip mall a few miles outside town. The strange urgency in Voss's eyes lately, like a man who knew the walls were closing in. Individually, none of it proved much. Together, it was beginning to sketch the outline of something far larger than a single dishonest sergeant. She thought about her father, and the kind of patience he must have needed, sitting somewhere very much like this 12 years earlier, piecing together the same kind of quiet, dangerous truth. She thought about the last time she had seen him alive, standing in the doorway of their old house, kissing the top of her head, before leaving for a shift he would never come home from. She had been 12 years old that night. Old enough to remember every detail, too young to understand any of it. She understood it now. She thought about the phrase engraved on the back of his watch, the one she had carried every day since his funeral. Duty, honor, quiet strength. She understood more than she ever had before exactly what those words had cost him. And she understood, sitting alone on that bench with 3 days left on the clock, exactly what they might cost her too. A part of her wondered if it would have been easier to simply take the mayor's appointment quietly. Step into the role of chief without ever walking these halls undercover, without ever letting Garrett Voss lay a hand on her. But she knew deep down that easier was never the same thing as right. Her father had not chosen the easier path either. He had chosen the true one, even when it cost him everything. She was willing to pay that same price if it came to that. She simply hoped, quietly sitting beneath that old oak tree with the whole town settling into sleep around her, that this town was still worth it. She thought it was. She had seen enough these past 6 days in Dorothy's tears, in Wyatt's steady hands carrying her box to the car, in Ruth's grateful grip and Peg's quiet warning offered anyway, despite her own fear to believe that Millbrook still had something worth saving underneath all that silence. She closed the notebook, tucked it away, and sat a while longer beneath the rustling leaves, letting the cool night air settle the last of the day's weight from her shoulders. When she finally rose to leave, the moon had climbed high above the trees, casting long, quiet shadows across the empty park. She walked back to her car, unhurried, unafraid, the small cracked watch resting steady in her pocket, exactly where it belonged. Sloane Hart, even suspended, even wounded, even walking away from that building with nothing but a small cardboard box and a cracked pocket watch, had absolutely no intention of walking away from the truth. 3 days remained, and she intended to use every single one of them. Somewhere above Millbrook, the same quiet stars that had watched over her father's last night on that rural road, now settled gently over his daughter, steady and unhurried, as if waiting patiently to see how this story would finally end. There is a kind of quiet that comes right before a storm breaks. The air goes still. The birds stop singing. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. Millbrook had lived inside that kind of quiet for 12 long years. But quiet does not mean peace. Sometimes it only means the truth is still gathering its strength. 3 days remained before the county hearing. 3 days before the fate of an entire police department and the memory of a good man would finally be decided. Sloane Hart did not spend those 3 days sitting still. The morning after her suspension, Sloane sat alone at her kitchen table, the small cardboard box from her desk still unopened beside her. She had not touched it. Instead, she held the old cassette tape Dorothy had given her, turning it slowly in her hands, studying the faded label where someone long ago had written a single word in fading ink. Truth. She thought about her father writing that word alone in this same town 12 years earlier, already sensing that his time might be running short. She thought about patience, about how much of it he must have carried quietly, building his case piece by piece, never once raising his voice, never once losing his composure, even as danger closed in around him. She understood him now more than she ever had before. Not just as her father, but as the man whose steps she was now walking in, whether Millbrook realized it yet or not. Outside her kitchen window, the town was waking up the same way it always did. A dog barking somewhere down the street. A school bus rumbling past, engine wheezing in the cold morning air. Life going on, unaware of how close it stood to finally learning the truth. Her pocket watch sat on the table beside the tape, its cracked glass catching the morning light. She had meant to have it repaired weeks ago before this assignment ever began, but something had always held her back. A quiet reluctance to change even the smallest detail of something her father had once carried close to his heart. Now staring at the crack running across the old dial, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe it was time. Maybe there was something in that old watch worth uncovering, the same way there was something in this town worth uncovering. She thought of Voss's hand opening, letting the watch fall to the tile floor on her very first morning. She thought of the sound it had made, small and sharp. The same sound that had somehow marked the beginning of everything that followed. She picked up her keys and drove into the center of Millbrook, toward a small shop she had noticed on her very first day. The shop belonged to a man named Harold Ellery, a watchmaker in his 80s who had repaired clocks and watches in that same building for over 50 years. The bell above his door jingled softly as she stepped inside. Rows of clocks lined every wall, ticking in a chorus of gentle, overlapping rhythms, some fast, some slow, all somehow existing together in a strange, comforting harmony. Harold looked up from his workbench, adjusting a pair of thick glasses perched low on his nose. "Well now," he said, his voice warm and slightly raspy. "Don't get many young faces in here anymore." "I was hoping you could take a look at something," Sloane said, holding out the pocket watch. Harold set aside the small brass clock he had been working on, wiping his hands on a well-worn apron before reaching for the watch. "Your grandfather's, is it?" he asked, studying the worn case with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his whole life around old things. "My father's," Sloane said. Something shifted in Harold's expression, a flicker of recognition passing quickly behind his eyes. "Walter Hart's girl," he said quietly. "I thought there was something familiar about you." Sloane blinked, surprised. "You knew my father?" "Everybody in this town knew your father," Harold said. "Good man. Used to bring his cruiser in for me to fix the radio antenna every so often, though I suspect that was mostly an excuse to sit and talk a while." He smiled faintly at the memory. "Terrible thing what happened to him." "I'm starting to understand just how terrible," Sloane said quietly. His hands trembled slightly with age as he took the watch, holding it gently up to the light, streaming through his front window. "Beautiful piece," he murmured, turning it slowly. "Old craftsmanship. They don't make them like this anymore." "It was my father's," Sloane said again, quieter this time. Harold nodded, as if that explained everything he needed to know. He set the watch down on a soft cloth on his workbench and began carefully removing the back casing with a small, delicate tool. His movements slow but sure, the practiced ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Sloane watched in silence, her heart beating a little faster than she expected. Harold paused suddenly, his brow furrowing. "Well now," he said softly, "that's unusual." "What is it?" "There's a false back here," he said, pointing with one trembling finger. "A hidden compartment." I've seen this kind of craftsmanship before, mostly in older pieces made for men who needed to carry something small and important without anyone else knowing. Sloane's breath caught in her throat. "Can you open it?" Harold nodded slowly, and with careful, practiced hands, he pressed gently against a nearly invisible seam along the inner casing. The false back clicked softly and slid open. Inside, folded into a small, tight square, was a single piece of paper yellowed slightly with age. Sloane's hands shook as she carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's. Small, neat, deliberate, the same handwriting she remembered from birthday cards and school permission slips, now carrying words far heavier than anything she had ever read from him before. "If you are reading this, something has happened to me. I have found proof that certain officers within this department have been covering for a fraud operation targeting elderly residents across the county. Officer G. Voss was present at more than one payoff exchange, though I believe he is not the one giving the orders. There is someone above him. Someone with far more power than a patrol officer. I recorded a conversation 2 nights ago that names names. I am keeping the tape with someone I trust completely. If anything happens to me, find that tape. Match it with what I have written here. Together they will be enough. Whatever happens, know that I did this because some things are worth protecting, even when protecting them costs everything. I love you more than these words could ever say. Dad." Sloane sat perfectly still, tears sliding silently down her face, the old shop quiet around her, except for the gentle ticking of dozens of clocks lining the walls. Harold, sensing the weight of the moment, said nothing. He simply placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and stepped quietly into the back room, giving her privacy to grieve and to hope all at once. She sat there a long while, letting herself feel all of it. The grief she had carried for 12 years. The fear of everything still ahead. And underneath, both something steadier, something like relief at finally holding proof of what she had always known in her heart to be true. Her father had not simply died in an accident. He had died protecting people who could not protect themselves. And now at last, she had the words to prove it. Harold returned quietly a while later, offering her a small cup of tea he had brewed in the back room, setting it beside her without a word, as if he understood exactly how little words could offer in a moment like this one. "Take whatever time you need," he said gently. "The shop isn't going anywhere." She stayed another hour, simply sitting with the letter, the tape, and the quiet hum of dozens of ticking clocks before finally thanking him, tucking everything carefully away and stepping back out into the cool afternoon light. That afternoon, Sloane brought both pieces to Dorothy's small house on the edge of town. They sat together at Dorothy's kitchen table, the damaged cassette tape resting between them alongside the folded letter from 12 years earlier. "He knew," Dorothy whispered, reading the letter through tear-filled eyes. "He knew he might not make it out. He tried to protect what mattered most," Sloane said quietly, "even when he was afraid." Dorothy reached for an old cassette player she had kept in a closet for years, dusting it off gently before placing the tape inside. She pressed play. For a long moment, there was only static. Then faintly through the damaged recording, a voice emerged. Younger, steadier, unmistakably Walter Hart. "Need this documented properly. You understand what happens if this gets out." Another voice responded, muffled, but recognizable enough. Younger, too. Nervous. "I didn't want any part of this. He said if I didn't help, he'd make sure I lost everything. My house, my job, everything." "Who gave the order?" Walter's voice asked steadily. "I need it." There was a long pause filled with static before the second voice finally answered, quiet and afraid. "Whitcomb, Commander Earl Whitcomb. He's been running this since before either of us wore a badge." The tape cut abruptly to static, the damaged section swallowing whatever came next. Sloane sat frozen, staring at the small tape player. "Whitcomb," she whispered. "Ruth Slater's husband's name." Dorothy's eyes widened. "No, not her husband. Her husband's older brother. Earl Whitcomb was police commander here decades ago before retiring quietly. He still lives just outside town. Still has friends in high places even now. But Ruth never mentioned a brother-in-law." "She wouldn't," Dorothy said. "The two of them haven't spoken in over 20 years. some falling out over their father's land long before I ever worked here. Ruth doesn't even say his name out loud anymore. I doubt she has any idea he's the one behind those phone calls. Sloane felt something cold settle in her chest. The very man who had built this entire corrupt system, who had likely ordered her father's death, was still alive, still respected, still hiding in plain sight all these years later, close enough to reach out and steal from his own family without a hint of remorse. And the second voice on that tape, young and frightened, pleading that he had no real choice. She recognized it now with painful clarity. It belonged to a much younger Garrett Voss. That evening, Sloane sat with this new understanding heavy on her heart. Voss was not the mastermind behind her father's death. He was in many ways just as trapped as anyone else. A patrol officer decades ago coerced into silence through threats and debt, forced to participate in something he never had the courage or the power to stop. That did not excuse what he had done. It did not excuse the cruelty he had shown her these past 6 days, or the cowardice of staying silent for 12 long years while an innocent man's memory was buried under a false report. But it did explain something important. Sometimes the loudest bullies are not the true architects of harm. Sometimes they are simply men who once made a single cowardly choice and spent the rest of their lives hiding behind anger, so they would never have to face what that choice had cost. She thought of her own father and the very different choice he had made, standing at that same crossroads decades ago. Two men roughly the same age offered the same kind of quiet corruption. One had said no and paid for it with his life. The other had said yes and had been paying for it in smaller, quieter ways every single day since. The next morning, day 8, Sloane made a decision. She drove to the station not as a suspended rookie sneaking in through a back door, but walking directly through the front entrance, her head held high. Dorothy looked up from her desk, giving her a small, encouraging nod. Wyatt spotted her immediately, rising quickly from his seat. "Sloane, you shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "You're still suspended?" "I know," she said. "But I need you to hear something. All of you." She gathered Wyatt along with 2 other officers she trusted into a small conference room and played them the damaged recording, along with reading her father's letter aloud. The room fell into stunned silence. 12 years, Wyatt said, finally, his voice tight with anger. 12 years and nobody ever tried to reopen this. "They didn't know," Sloane said quietly, "because the people who did know were too afraid to speak." She looked around the room, meeting each officer's eyes in turn. "I need your help," she said, "not because I'm asking as a favor, but because you took an oath, the same oath my father once took, to protect people who can't always protect themselves." Wyatt nodded firmly. "Whatever you need." He pulled out his phone, showing the others the photograph he had taken of the altered evidence log days earlier. "This is how they framed her," he said. "Dates don't match. Handwriting's rushed. Somebody wrote a week's worth of entries in one sitting." One of the other officers, a quiet man named Reeves, who had said little in his years at the department, finally spoke. "I've had my own doubts about Voss for a while now," he admitted. "Never had proof of anything. Just a feeling." "Feelings are where truth usually starts," Sloane said. "We just need to finish the job now." The room grew quiet a moment, each officer sitting with the weight of what they had just heard and what it would mean to finally stand against a version of this department they had all in some small way learned to live with for far too long. "Whatever happens at that hearing," Sloane said finally, "I need to know I can count on every person in this room to tell the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it costs you something." One by one, they nodded. It was not a grand gesture. No raised voices, no dramatic vows. Just a room full of tired, ordinary people quietly deciding to finally do the right thing. Sometimes she thought that was exactly how real change began. Later that same day, Sloane requested a private meeting with Sergeant Garrett Voss. He arrived at the small diner on Main Street, looking older than she remembered from just days before, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, his hands trembling slightly around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Peg, wiping down the counter nearby, glanced between them a moment before quietly retreating to the far end of the diner, giving them space. "I know what you have," Voss said quietly, before Sloane could even speak. "Word travels fast in a small station." Sloane studied him carefully. "I heard the tape," she said. "I know about Earl Whitcomb. I know you weren't the one giving orders that night." Voss's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening with something that looked almost like relief mixed with 12 years of buried shame. "I was 40 years old," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Already 15 years on this job and still just a patrol officer, passed over twice for sergeant. I owed money to the wrong people. Whitcomb found out. Said he could make my debts disappear if I just looked the other way on a few things. I told myself it was small, harmless, until your father started asking questions that got too close." He looked up at her eyes, red-rimmed. "I didn't kill him," he said quickly. "I want you to know that. I never touched that car. But I signed that report. I said the scene was clean when I knew it wasn't. I let them close the case because I was scared, and because by then I was already in too deep to climb back out." Sloane sat quietly, letting him speak. "Every single day, for 12 years, Voss continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've walked those same hallways your father used to walk. And every single day some part of me has hated myself a little more." "Is that why you were so hard on me?" Sloane asked quietly. "Because I reminded you of him." Voss closed his eyes. "You have his exact same stillness," he said. "The same quiet way of watching everything, without ever needing to raise your voice. It scared me the moment you walked through that door. I told myself you were just some rookie easy to push around. I think somewhere deep down, I already knew better." He glanced down at his hands, still slightly trembling around the untouched coffee cup. "That watch," he said quietly. "The one I threw down on your first day. I've thought about that more than I'd like to admit. Small, cruel thing to do to a stranger. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. It always does." Sloane leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here for revenge, Garrett," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time. "I'm here because a good man's memory deserves the truth. And because Ruth Whitcomb and people just like her deserve protection from whatever is still happening in this town." Voss looked up, startled. "Whitcomb's scam operation?" Sloane said. "It's still running. Elderly residents across 3 counties losing their savings, and I believe Earl Whitcomb is still behind it all these years later." Voss's face went pale. "There's a hearing in 2 days," Sloane continued. "One that will decide whether this entire department survives. If we don't bring the full truth into the light, now it disappears forever. My father's memory disappears. Ruth's stolen savings disappear, and Earl Whitcomb walks free for the rest of his life." For a long moment, Voss said nothing, staring down at his untouched coffee. Then slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something small and metal onto the table between them. The missing evidence weapon. "I still have it," he said quietly. "I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Some part of me knew eventually someone would come looking for the truth." He looked up at her eyes, filled with 12 years of quiet regret. "I owe your father an apology I can never give him in person," he said. "Maybe this is as close as I'll ever get to paying that debt." "It's a start," Sloane said quietly. "It's not everything, but it's a start." Voss nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Whatever it is, I'll do it." "Testify," Sloane said simply. "Tell the truth in front of the whole town, exactly the way you just told it to me." Voss let out a long, unsteady breath. "All right," he said. "All right, I will." That night, the night before the hearing, Sloane did not sleep much. She sat at her kitchen table long after midnight, the tape, the letter, and the recovered evidence weapon laid out carefully in front of her, along with the notebook she had filled over the past 9 days. She read back through every entry. The mismatched duty roster. The signature that didn't belong where it was. The prepaid phone traced back to a strip mall from her childhood. Wyatt's photograph of the altered evidence log. Voss's trembling confession over cold coffee at the diner. 9 days ago, she had walked into Millbrook carrying nothing but a cracked watch and a quiet promise to herself. Tomorrow, she would walk into that hearing, carrying 12 years of buried truth and the fragile hope that a town willing to look away for over a decade might finally be ready to look directly at what it had ignored. She thought about calling Mayor Whitfield, just to hear a steady voice before the biggest day of her life. But she decided once again that some things were hers, to sit with quietly alone, the same way her father always had. Around 2 in the morning, she finally allowed herself a few hours of restless sleep, her father's letter tucked safely beneath her pillow, as if some part of her needed him close by for whatever the morning would bring. Day 9 arrived, cool and clear, the sky over Millbrook, a soft autumn blue. The county hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon at the small municipal building downtown, where residents packed into rows of folding chairs, buzzing with quiet anticipation. Rumors had spread quickly through the town over the past 2 days. Something big was happening at the police department. Something involving the new rookie who had been slapped, then suspended, then somehow vindicated within a matter of hours. Peg had closed the diner early that day, unwilling to miss whatever was about to happen. She sat near the back, arms crossed, watching the doors with sharp, curious eyes. Ruth Whitcomb sat near the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, Dorothy seated beside her for support. Wyatt stood near the back of the room alongside Reeves and 2 other officers, who had chosen finally to stand up and speak the truth after years of uncomfortable silence. Captain Pruitt sat at the front table alongside Mayor Grace Whitfield, whose expression remained carefully neutral, though her eyes flickered occasionally toward the back entrance, waiting. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doors opened. Sloane Hart walked in, but she was not dressed as a rookie officer that day. She wore a crisp, formal uniform, a new badge gleaming on her chest, one that read in clear engraved letters, Chief of Police. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Mayor Whitfield rose to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the packed hall. 9 days ago, I asked a young woman to walk into this department quietly, without title or rank, to help us understand exactly what has been happening within these walls for far too long. She gestured toward Sloane. "This is Sloane Hart," the mayor continued. "Daughter of our former chief of police, Walter Hart, who died 12 years ago under circumstances this town was never given the full truth about." The room fell utterly silent. "As of today," the mayor said, "she has been officially appointed as our new chief of police." Sloane stepped forward, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the room. "9 days ago, I walked through those doors as a stranger," she said. "I was mocked. I was dismissed. I watched a sergeant throw my father's watch to the ground and laugh about it. And 2 days later, I was struck in front of my fellow officers for simply asking this department to treat a grieving widow with basic human decency." Ruth's hand rose gently to cover her mouth, tears already falling freely down her cheeks. "I did not come here for revenge," Sloane continued. "I came here because 12 years ago my father discovered a truth that cost him his life. A truth that this town has lived beside quietly for over a decade without ever fully understanding it." She held up the damaged cassette tape along with her father's handwritten letter. "This recording combined with this letter proves that my father was investigating a fraud operation targeting elderly residents across this county. An operation that was protected for years through fear, coercion, and silence." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "The man responsible for ordering my father's death and for building this operation from the very beginning is former police commander Earl Whitcomb." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several older residents turned to look at one another, stunned expressions crossing their faces. Ruth Whitcomb sat frozen, her hands still pressed against her lips, shock and grief mingling in her tear-filled eyes. Dorothy reached over, gently squeezing her hand, steadying her through the wave of disbelief. Sloane continued, her voice steady, despite the weight of everything she carried. "Sergeant Garrett Voss was coerced into silence decades ago through threats and manipulation," she said. "That does not excuse the harm his silence caused or the cruelty he has shown in recent days. But he has chosen in these final hours to come forward and to help bring this truth into the light." She gestured toward Voss, who stood quietly near the side of the room, his head bowed, unable to meet the eyes of the crowd. He has returned key evidence and provided testimony that corroborates everything on this recording, Sloan said. That choice does not erase the past, but it matters. Voss stepped forward when asked, and in a voice far quieter than the one he had used to mock Sloan just days before he confirmed everything she had said. The threats, the debt, the false report, the years of silence. The crowd listened in stunned, heavy quiet. When he finished, he simply stepped back, eyes down, and let the weight of the room settle over him. Sloan turned toward the mayor and the assembled council members. I am asking this hearing not simply to decide whether this department survives, she said. I am asking you to help finally bring justice to a case that has waited 12 long years, and to protect the elderly residents of this county from a man who has hidden behind respectability for far too long. Earl Whitcomb, seated quietly near the back of the room, wearing a tailored suit and an expression of practiced calm, rose slowly to his feet. This is absurd, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. A damaged tape, a letter with no verified authorship. This is nothing but speculation dressed up as evidence. Sloan turned to face him directly. The recording captures your name spoken clearly by a frightened young officer 12 years ago, she said calmly. Sergeant Voss has confirmed under oath that the voice belongs to him and that the man he was speaking to was you. Boss and boss, one. She looked toward the council members. I would also like to submit financial records obtained legally through the State Oversight Board over the past several months, showing a pattern of suspicious transfers linked to elderly victims across 3 counties, many of which trace back to shell accounts connected to Mr. Whitcomb's family trust. The room buzzed with stunned whispers. Whitcomb's face had gone pale, his earlier composure cracking slightly at the edges. You cannot prove any of this, he said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. That is exactly what a formal criminal investigation will determine, Sloan said calmly. Which is why I am formally requesting on behalf of this department that the state attorney's office open a full investigation into Earl Whitcomb effective immediately. Whitcomb's lawyer, seated beside him, leaned over and whispered something urgent. But Whitcomb waved him off, his composure fraying visibly now in front of the entire town. You have no idea what you're doing, he said, turning toward Sloan, his voice low and sharp. 12 years and you think a damaged tape and a dead man's letter change anything? They change everything, Sloan said quietly. Because for 12 years, this town believed a lie you built to protect yourself. Today they get to hear the truth instead. From the front row, Ruth Whitcomb slowly rose to her feet, her voice trembling but clear enough to carry across the silent room. He is my husband's brother, she said. We have not spoken in 20 years. I never once suspected. I never imagined he could do something like this. Not to me, not to anyone. Her words landed heavier than any piece of evidence Sloan had presented, a quiet, human confirmation of exactly how far Earl Whitcomb had been willing to go, even against his own family. The council members conferred quietly for several long minutes, the room holding its collective breath. Finally, the head council member rose. Given the evidence presented today, she said, this council formally authorizes a full state investigation into former Commander Earl Whitcomb. Furthermore, this council finds sufficient grounds to overturn the original closure of case number 1147, the death of Chief Walter Hart, reclassifying it as an active investigation into possible foul play. She paused, looking out over the crowd. And as for the question that brought us here today, she continued, whether the Millbrook Police Department retains its license to operate this council, votes unanimously to reauthorize the department under the leadership of its newly appointed chief and under a new set of oversight reforms designed to make sure nothing like this ever takes root here again. A soft collective gasp rippled through the crowd, quickly followed by a wave of quiet applause. Ruth Whitcomb wept openly, now gripping Dorothy's hand tightly. Wyatt, standing near the back, allowed himself a small, relieved smile. Voss remained still, his head bowed, tears silently falling. 12 years of buried guilt finally beginning slowly to lift from his shoulders. Two uniformed state investigators moved quietly through the crowd toward Earl Whitcomb, who sat rigid in his seat, his practiced calm finally completely gone. Captain Pruitt lingered near the front table, long after most of the crowd had filtered out into the afternoon sun. Watching the investigators lead Whitcomb toward a waiting car outside the tall front windows. 12 years of quiet guilt sat heavy on his shoulders even now, even with the truth finally out in the open. Sloane found him there, still watching the window. "You did the right thing," she said quietly, letting this play out the way it needed to. "I should have asked more questions 12 years ago," Pruitt said, not turning around. "Instead, I told myself it wasn't my place." "You're asking them now," Sloane said. "That still matters." Pruitt finally turned to face her, something easing slightly in his tired expression. "Your father used to tell me the same thing," he said. "That it's never too late to finally ask the right question." "I suppose I finally believe him." He extended his hand and Sloane shook it firmly. "I'd be honored to serve under you, Chief Hart," he said. "For as long as you'll have me." "I wouldn't want anyone else standing beside me," Sloane said. "Not after everything we've been through to get here." Pruitt allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one Sloane had seen from him since the day she first walked into his office as a stranger. "Your father used to smile just like that," he added quietly. "Right before he'd tell you something you probably didn't want to hear, but needed to." "Some things really don't change," Sloane said softly. In the weeks that followed, the investigation moved quickly. Earl Whitcomb was formally charged with fraud conspiracy and obstruction of justice, with additional charges related to Walter Hart's death, still under active investigation by state authorities. Financial records eventually traced the scam operation back through nearly a decade of victims' elderly residents across 3 counties who had trusted a friendly voice on the other end of a phone call, never imagining it belonged to a man once sworn to protect them. Investigators found ledgers hidden in a storage unit 2 towns over. Meticulous records of names, amounts, and dates stretching back further than anyone had realized. Millbrook's local paper ran the story for 3 consecutive weeks each edition, selling out faster than the one before it. Longtime residents finally piecing together years of quiet suspicion into something concrete and undeniable. Several other victims came forward once the story broke, encouraged by Ruth's public testimony to finally speak up about calls and losses. They had been too embarrassed or too frightened to report on their own. Sloane made sure every single one of them was contacted personally. Their cases folded carefully into the growing investigation. Garrett Voss, due to his cooperation and testimony, avoided the harshest possible penalties. Though he was formally stripped of his rank and chose to resign from the force, entirely accepting early retirement under a cloud of long overdue accountability. On his last day, he stopped by Sloane's new office, standing quietly in the doorway. "I know I can't undo 12 years, he said quietly. "But I hope somehow this counts for something." Sloane studied him for a long moment. "It counts," she said simply. "It matters that you finally chose to tell the truth. That's not nothing, Garrett. That's something a lot of people never find the courage to do." He nodded once, eyes glistening, and reached into his pocket, setting something small on her desk before turning to leave. It was an old worn watch of his own, a plain steel piece he had carried for decades. "Figured it was time I stopped hiding behind things. I don't deserve to keep close," he said quietly. "Maybe somebody who still believes in second chances can put it to better use than I ever did." He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps fading slowly down the hallway, and quietly left the building for the final time. Sloane sat looking at the small worn watch for a long moment after he had gone, before setting it gently in a desk drawer, not quite ready yet to decide what, if anything, it meant. 2 weeks later, Millbrook held a small ceremony inside the police station, the very same building where just weeks earlier, Sloane Hart had walked in as a stranger and been struck across the face in front of an entire room of silent witnesses. Now that same room was filled with warmth and quiet pride. Dorothy stood at the front, holding a small, polished badge in her trembling hands. "It would be my honor," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "to properly pin this badge onto our new chief of police." Sloane stepped forward, and Dorothy carefully fastened the badge onto her uniform, her hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "Your father would be so proud of you," Dorothy whispered. Sloane blinked back tears. "Thank you for keeping that tape safe all these years. For never giving up on the truth, even when it felt impossible." The room broke into warm applause. Wyatt stepped forward next, along with Reeves and several other officers, all offering handshakes and quiet words of respect and admiration. Ruth Whitcomb, seated near the front, in a place of honor, rose slowly to her feet, holding a small, delicately embroidered handkerchief. "I made this for you," she said, her voice trembling slightly with gratitude. "It's not much, but it's my way of saying thank you for treating an old woman like she mattered on a day when everyone else had already decided she didn't." Sloane took the handkerchief, gently holding it against her chest for a moment. "You always mattered, Mrs. Whitcomb," she said softly. "I'm just glad I was here to remind this town of that." Ruth reached out, taking Sloane's hand in both of hers. "I heard about the money too," she said quietly. "The state says some of it might be recovered in time. But honestly, dear, getting my name back matters more to me than any of that ever did." "You never lost your name," Sloane said. "You just needed this town to remember it." Peg, standing near the back with a tray of coffee cups she had insisted on bringing from the diner, called out warmly, "Someone's got to keep this department caffeinated properly now that the chief's in charge." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, soft and grateful. The kind of laughter that only comes after something heavy has finally safely been set down. Even Reeves, usually quiet, found himself smiling as he accepted a cup from Peg's tray, raising it slightly toward Sloane in a small silent toast. Wyatt made his way over, eventually holding a cup of his own. "For what it's worth," he said. "I'm glad I decided to talk to you on that bench your first day." "Me too," Sloane said, smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks, without any weight behind it. "Turns out not everybody in this building needed a lesson in decency after all. Just needed the right person to remind us what it looked like," Wyatt said, raising his cup slightly toward her, the small gesture carrying more weight than any speech could have managed. Later that evening, once the small celebration had quieted and most of the department had gone home for the night, Sloane sat alone in her new office, the same office where Captain Pruitt, now serving proudly as her second-in-command, had once quietly kept her secret for 9 long, difficult days. On her desk sat the small silver pocket watch, its glass now perfectly repaired, gleaming softly under the desk lamp. She opened it gently, glancing once more at the small hidden compartment where her father's final letter had rested quietly for 12 long years, waiting patiently for someone brave enough and patient enough to finally find it. She closed the watch softly and set it down in the center of her desk, where it would remain every single day from that moment forward. Beside it, she placed Voss's old worn watch as well. A quiet, unspoken reminder of exactly how far a person could fall and exactly how far they might still climb back if they finally found the courage to try. A quiet reminder. Not of anger, not of revenge, but of everything her father had believed in and everything she now carried forward in his place. Duty, honor, and the kind of quiet strength that does not need to shout to finally be heard. That night, as she drove home along the same quiet streets where her father once walked his own patrol decades earlier, Sloane rolled down her window, letting the cool autumn air move gently across her face. Millbrook looked different to her now, not because the buildings had changed or the streets had been repaved, but because for the first time in 12 long years, the silence resting over this small town no longer felt heavy with secrets. It felt instead like peace. The kind of peace that only comes after the truth has finally fully been allowed to breathe. She drove past the diner where Peg's handwritten sign still hung in the window, faded slightly now, but still legible. "We remember who helped Ruth Whitcomb." She drove past the small cemetery on the edge of town, slowing just enough to glance toward the rows of quiet headstones resting beneath the darkening sky before continuing on. She would visit properly again soon, she told herself. But tonight she simply wanted her father to know, in whatever quiet way, the dead might still know such things, that it was finally truly finished. She thought about the 2 watches now sitting side by side on her desk, one repaired, one worn and plain, both carrying the weight of choices made decades apart by two very different men. She thought about Dorothy, who had carried a secret for 12 years out of fear and finally found the courage to set it down. About Wyatt, who had trusted his instincts even when the whole department seemed determined to look away. About Ruth, who had walked into a police station in tears and walked out of a hearing with her name and her dignity fully restored. About Peg, who had offered a small quiet warning at a diner counter, not knowing it would become the first thread in unraveling something far larger than either of them understood at the time. A town, she realized, was never really made of buildings or street signs or old brick police stations. It was made of exactly these small, quiet choices repeated over and over by ordinary people deciding again and again whether to look away or to finally speak up. Millbrook had chosen at last to speak. Somewhere out there, an old man would soon face justice for decisions made decades ago. A grieving daughter had finally brought her father's memory back into the light. A town had learned in the hardest way possible that respect is never something owed to a badge or a title or even to age or authority. It is something earned quietly, one honest choice at a time. And on that night, driving slowly through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Sloane Hart finally allowed herself for the first time in 12 years to feel something close to whole. She parked outside her small rented house, the porch light glowing warm against the early evening dark, and sat a moment longer in the stillness of her car, one hand resting gently over the pocket where her father's watch would sit again tomorrow morning, steady and unhurried, ready for whatever the next chapter of Millbrook still had waiting. Above her, the same quiet stars that had once watched over a young officer's very first night in this town, now settled softly over its new chief patient and unhurried exactly the way good things so often are.